You know, when we hear about ancient laws, it's easy to just picture a long, dry list of do this, don't do that. But what if it was something more? What if it was actually a super detailed blueprint for how an entire community connected with the divine? A plan that covered everything from saying you're sorry to sharing a meal. Well, today we're going to decode that exact blueprint and see what it tells us about their world.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll get into why these rules had to be so precise. Then, we'll dive into the two main kinds of offerings, the ones for making things right and the ones for celebrating together. After that, we'll look at the really strict rules around the sacred meals, and finally, we'll uncover the pretty fascinating economics that made the whole thing tick.
So, first things first, why all the fuss? Why was every little detail so important? Well, you've got to understand, these weren't just old traditions or helpful suggestions. For the ancient Israelites, these were direct commands from God, given to Moses at this huge defining moment in their history. This was the absolute foundation for their entire way of worship. And the text is super clear about where the authority comes from. It says these rules were given by the Lord to Moses, right there at Mount Sinai. Now that framing is everything. It elevates this from just, good human advice into the sacred architecture of their entire society. It defined exactly how they were supposed to approach God from that day forward.
Okay, so how did this blueprint work when somebody messed up? I mean, things go wrong, right? A huge part of the system was about restoring that relationship with God, and the guilt offering is the perfect case study for how this was all laid out step by step. The guilt offering was considered most holy. That's a big deal. Its entire job, its whole purpose, was to make things right after someone did wrong, to patch up that sacred connection. This was a really solemn, serious, and deeply meaningful ritual.
And the process for this, wow, it was incredibly specific. I mean, nothing was left to chance. You can see this careful separation. Certain fatty parts, seen as the best, richest portions, were set aside as God's share and burned on the altar. But that last step, that's absolutely key to understanding the whole system. The rest of the meat wasn't thrown away. It was eaten by the priests, but only in the holy space of the sanctuary. That one act connects the spiritual with the very practical. So right there, you see this kind of two-for-one deal happening. This wasn't just a spiritual thing. It was also a super practical way to provide for people. The priest who actually performs the ceremony gets a share of the offering. It's like this sacred economy designed to keep itself going. But it wasn't all just serious business and making up for mistakes. Not at all. The system also had this amazing, celebratory, communal side, and that's where the fellowship offering comes in. It was literally a way for people to share a meal together, and with God, in a sacred setting. So, why might you bring a fellowship offering? Well, there were a few reasons. It could be a simple act of gratitude, just a way of saying thank you to God. It could be to follow through on a promise or a vow that you made. Or it could be a free will offering, something you give just because you want to, out of pure devotion. Now here's where it gets really cool. Your reason for giving the offering actually changed the rules for the meal. If it was for Thanksgiving, maybe because something amazing just happened, it had this sense of urgency. You had to eat all of it on the very same day. But if it was for a vow or just a free will gift, you had a little more breathing room. You could eat the leftovers the next day too. But, and this is a big but, there was a hard deadline. Any meat still hanging around on day 3 was considered impure. You couldn't eat it. In fact, if you did, the whole offering was rejected and you were held accountable. So yeah, that timeline was serious stuff. And this whole idea of timelines and purity leads us to the bigger rules that governed these sacred meals. It wasn't just about when you ate. It was a whole system designed to keep everything pure and orderly around the holy act of sharing this food. So that makes you wonder, right? What else was in the rule book? Who was even allowed to eat this stuff? And what things were totally, absolutely off limits? Well, the forbidden list was crystal clear. The fat from the main livestock animals, that was for God, burned on the altar. And then there's the big one, no eating blood from any creature, ever. It was seen as the life force. But purity was a huge deal in other ways too. If the meat touched anything considered unclean, it was out. And it wasn't just about the food, it was about you. If you were ceremonially unclean, maybe from touching a dead body or having a certain illness, you were barred from the meal until you went through a purification process. It was a state of being, not just about being physically dirty. And the consequences? They were severe. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. The text says if you eat blood, you must be cut off from their people. That is huge. It meant a complete separation from your entire community.
This was about way more than just your diet. This was about belonging.
Okay, so we've looked at rules for making amends, rules for celebrating, and all the purity stuff that went with them. So let's get to our last piece of the puzzle and see how this all actually worked, day in and day out. Let's talk about the economics of the altar.
And this is so fundamental to understanding the whole thing. This complex system of worship was also a real, functioning economy. The offerings people brought weren't just symbolic gestures that went up in smoke. This was literally how the priests and their families were supported. It's how they put food on the table.
And the system was just amazingly detailed. Every type of offering provided a different kind of support. A guilt offering, the priest got the meat. A burnt offering where the whole animal was burned, the priest still got the animal's valuable hide. Grain offerings went to the priest, and from that big communal fellowship meal, he got specific prime cuts, the breast and the right thigh. Nothing was wasted. Every single piece had a purpose.
And you have to realize, this wasn't some temporary fix or a form of charity. The text calls it their perpetual share. It was commanded by God to last for all generations, starting from the exact moment the priests were first anointed. This was a permanent, divinely ordered institution.
So, when you step back and you put all of these pieces together, you realize this is so much more than a list of rituals. It is a complete, totally integrated blueprint. It's a system that handled spiritual problems, community celebrations, public health through purity rules, and a sustainable economy for its leaders, all in one package.
This incredibly detailed blueprint really governed every part of sacred life. It made invisible spiritual realities visible, and it brought order to what could be chaotic. And that kind of makes you think, doesn't it? What are the unseen blueprints, the unspoken rules and social contracts that govern how our own communities work today? What's really holding our world together?